Hey guys, AJ here. Now that it's his second appearance on a radar banner, we're finally gonna cover Xingqiu and why he's Electro Queen's best reaction support. First, we'll go over everything you need to know about Xingqiu himself, including his gender, which is male, and in the latter half I'll discuss the Xingqiu-Keqing duel and why that is such a good combination. Timestamps are in the description, so if you want to skip the character guide part, feel free to do so. Xingqiu has not only very useful supportive capabilities, but he also has a very high damage ceiling and can contribute a lot to your team's total damage. He fits into almost any comp, he's a prime choice for permafreeze, he's good for vaporize, and amazing for electrocharged, for reasons we'll discover later. His elemental skill, which I'll just refer to as his E ability for the rest of the video, is a quick double strike burst ability that summons 3 Hydro Swords around you, 4 if you have C1, and applies the wet status on yourself for a duration of about 0.3 seconds, so you can use it to cleanse burning and the smoldering flames debuff, but it can also get you frozen. The swords he summons remain active even if you swap out of Xingqiu, and they stay for 15 seconds or until you get hit by an enemy attack, upon which they break, one at a time, for every hit you take. And his first passive makes it so that for every sword that breaks, your currently active character is healed for 6% of Xingqiu's max HP. If you don't get hit by anything, then they just disappear after 15 seconds, and you get healed then for all remaining swords at once. As long as you have at least one sword up, you're also more resistant to interruption, which is a very useful perk of this skill. If you've ever played Dragon Nest, this is basically like super armor, and you also take reduced damage. This damage reduction scales with talent level and Xingqiu's Hydro damage bonus, of which he gets 20% for free from his second passive. So even though 6% of his max HP may not seem like much healing, it's very efficient healing, because you only get healed when you actually get hit, which is when you most need it, and you didn't take as much damage from that hit as you would have without this skill to begin with, because of its damage reduction. Now the damage portion of this skill has one of the highest multipliers of any elemental skill in this game. In fact, its damage potential is so high that you could build him entirely around this double strike and play him as a one-shot burst unit. I won't be covering that in this video, but if you're interested in that, I recommend you check out this channel. Just recently he released a guide on how to build Xingqiu like that, and he literally just runs around and deletes everything the game has to offer with one button press, so go check him out, he can tell you everything you need to know. Link in the description. Now to balance the pure awesomeness of this skill, it does have a very long cooldown of 21 seconds, so that's something that we need to deal with. His elemental burst, or just his Q ability or ultimate, is in part very similar to his elemental skill, in that it also summons your 3 to 4 Hydro Swords. These also stay active for 15 seconds, you can freely swap through your characters, but this time the swords don't break even if you get hit. You still get the same damage reduction and resistance to interruption that you get from his E, but since the swords don't break, you don't get healed while his ultimate is active. Only at the end, when the swords disappear, and you get healed for all 3 to 4 swords again. His Q also makes it so that every normal attack by your active character summons a wave of Hydro Sword projectiles that fly in the direction you're facing and deal damage and apply Hydro to enemies they hit. These sword waves have an internal cooldown of about 1 second, and at base the number of swords in each wave alternates between 2 and 3. Each individual sword can crit independently, and because of the long duration of the skill and the fact that you're shooting multiple swords per wave, the damage ceiling of the skill can reach ridiculous levels if you make efficient use of it. This ability is also what makes him such a great reaction support in general, because once activated you get 15 seconds of Hydro application for whatever reaction you're trying to pull off, and all you have to do is perform normal attacks. Having to do normal attacks is also one of its downsides though, along with its very high cost of 80 energy, its long cooldown of 20 seconds, and the fact that it's mostly single target damage. Since his ultimate is where the bulk of his damage and elemental reaction potential lies, you should always prioritize leveling this talent and getting it as high as possible first, then his E, and lastly his basic attacks, if at all. In my opinion, you don't need these whatsoever, because there's no reason really to ever use them. Now that we know what he does, let's go over his weapon options. Sacrificial Sword is considered his best in-slot weapon, even though it has quite low base attack. In part because it gives a massive amount of energy recharge that he very much needs, but mainly for its passive effect that gives you a certain chance to reset the cooldown of your E. Getting off 2 casts of this skill that usually has a 21-second cooldown, and generating 2 batches of elemental particles instead of just 1 is the best way to achieve high uptime on his ultimate. If refinements are an option for you, refinement 3+ is ideal, because this is where the cooldown of the weapon's effect matches that of your E. So from that point onwards, you'll never have to worry about this effect's cooldown again, only about whether it procs or not. If you don't have this sword, energy recharge is still his most important stat until you reach consistent ultimate uptime, so any other ER sword will do as well. If it procs, Favonia's sword gives you the highest amount of energy possible in a single cast of his E. Festering Desire is the absolute best free-to-play option for him, trading a bit of ER for slightly higher base attack. And if you have Skyward Blade and aren't already using that on Bennett, then you can use that as well. If you missed Albedo's event and you didn't get Festering Desire, you can still use the Skyrider's sword, which is also free to play. Your goal is to get at least 200% energy recharge. You don't necessarily need a ton more than that, especially with Sacrificial Sword, but certainly not less. If you somehow manage to get to 200% ER just with your artifacts, you can also go for more offensive weapons. One of the best and cheapest options here is actually the 3-star Harbinger of Dawn. Gives a bunch of crit rate and crit damage, and because you don't have Xingqiu on the field for very long, relatively speaking, it's easier to keep his HP high and this sword's effect active. Black Sword, Blackcliff Longsword, Summit Shaper, and Aquila Favonia can all work as offensive stat sticks, though in a sense none of them are optimal because with a support Xingqiu you're not doing normal and charged attacks, you don't deal physical damage, and you cannot build stacks off field. Iron Sting would be another free-to-play option, but Elemental Mastery is only useful if you vaporize stuff with his Hydro Swords. Freeze doesn't deal damage at all, and with Electro Charge, most of the time it's actually not he who triggers the reaction. We'll go over that in detail in the latter half of this video. Now let's get into his stats and artifacts. For main stats, you'll want either attack percent or ER on your Sands, Hydro damage on your Cup, and then crit rate or crit damage on your Circlet, depending on what weapon you use and how your substats roll, although attack percent is also an option if you don't have good crit circlets. For substats, you're primarily looking for ER until you reach at least 200%, crit rate and crit damage, and then attack percent. Elemental Mastery is not a priority at all, unless you do Vaporize and have a way of consistently triggering those Vaporize reactions with him. In all other cases, just go for your typical DPS substats. Now for artifact sets, you have 3 major options. The first is 4-piece Noblesse. The 2-piece effect enhances Xingqiu's already powerful ultimate, and the 4-piece effect is useful in any comp for the team-wide attack buff. Strictly speaking, there are other units that make better use of this 4-piece effect, because on Xingqiu this becomes a 12-second attack buff on a 20-second cooldown ability, but it's still a great choice if you don't already have somebody else in your team that uses this set. The second option is 2-piece Noblesse and 2-piece Depth of Heart. The additional 15% Hydro damage not only boosts his damage even further, but also his damage reduction buff. In terms of consistency, this is by far the best option because both effects are completely unconditional and always active. If you only have one of either 2-piece Hydro or 2-piece Noblesse, you can substitute the missing set with 2 Gladiators as well. The third and last option is 4-piece Thunder Soother. Now this one only works if you run him with an Electro unit, but if you do, it works exceptionally well and has amazing uptime because of how Electro and Hydro both persist on attacked enemies. Although you pretty much waste the 2-piece bonus, you still get the same 35% damage increase that you would get from 2 Noblesse to Depth of Heart. The biggest downside to using this set is that it forces you to use him in combination with an Electro unit, but if you were planning to do that anyway, its biggest advantage is that it allows you to save a ton of resin in the long run because you can grind the gear for both Xingqiu and your Electro unit of choice in the same artifact domain, assuming that your Electro unit wants either of these 2 sets. As for Constellations, Xingqiu is perfectly viable and fully functional without any Constellations, but if you want to go for some, here's what you would get. C1 simply increases the number of Hydro Swords that are summoned by both your E and Q by 1. This doesn't do anything for your damage, but it increases the total amount of healing you're able to receive. C2 increases the duration of your ultimate by 3 seconds, and enemies hit by Hydro Swords have their Hydro resistance reduced by 15%. This is his best constellation together with C6 and a great place to stop at if you're going for constellations at all. It's a tremendous damage boost because you can fire up to 3 more sword waves per ult, and Resistance Shred is the best direct multiplier to your total damage output, much better than elemental damage or attack percent buffs. C3 boosts your ultimate by 3 levels, C4 increases the damage of your E ability while your ultimate is active, C5 boosts your E by 3 levels, and C6 is another huge damage increase because it alters the number of Hydro Swords per wave to follow a new pattern of 2, 3, and then 5 instead of the previous 2, 3, 2, 3. C6 also lets you regenerate 3 energy for every third Hydro Sword wave, so the one with 5 swords, if that sword wave hits an enemy. This means you're much less dependent on energy recharge and have better uptime in general, because even with an ultimate of average efficiency, you'd get between 12 to 15 energy back, which is around 15% or more of its cost. Now that we got all that, how do we actually play Xingqiu? Because of his long ability durations and cooldowns, you actually don't see him on the field all that often. But if his abilities are ready, you want to swap to Xingqiu, press E, then Q, and swap out again. This way you don't waste time waiting around to pick up the hydro particles generated by your E, plus his Q animation can be cancelled pretty quickly by swapping to another unit, as you can see here. With the Sacrificial Sword proc, the order becomes E, Q, and then E again, and then it's up to you if you want to wait and pick up the second batch of hydro particles yourself, or swap out immediately. So, those are all the basics. Now let's get into the Xingqiu Keqing combo. Xingqiu synergizes very well with almost any main DPS in the game, but the reason he's so great with Keqing specifically actually has to do with the artifact sets that are currently available to her as an electro carry. We have Thunder Soother and Thundering Fury. Both of these sets have weaknesses because they're rather conditional and not easy to maintain uptime on, to the point where people usually recommend simply going for 2 Thundering Fury and 2 Gladiators because that is easiest to build and works under all circumstances. If you have Xingqiu, however, I would say that he single-handedly takes care of those weaknesses and makes them perfectly viable choices. For the effect of Thunder Soother, or just TS, you need to have Electro applied to the enemy that you're attacking to get its 35% damage increase. This one isn't that bad because Keqing applies Electro with basically anything she does, but you still can't really afford bringing Pyro or Cryo Sub DPS units into your team because those elements react with your Electro and consume it, meaning you'd have small windows of downtime on your TS effect. Now if you want to avoid that, you can either run Mono Electro, where you pass on elemental reactions altogether, or you can run Hydro, because Electro Charge is the only Electro-related reaction that doesn't immediately consume the elements that triggered it, meaning that both Hydro and Electro can persist on the target. Practically speaking, what this means is that as long as you keep applying both Electro and Hydro, you can essentially get 100% uptime on the 4-piece effect of Thunder Soother. And Xingqiu undoubtedly has the best Hydro application in the game. Now that said, 4-piece Thunder Soother is definitely also playable without Xingqiu, but with him in the team you get to have your elemental reactions without having to sacrifice uptime on your 4-piece set effect. Now for the Thundering Fury 4-piece set effect, maybe you could even go as far as saying that without Xingqiu, 4TF Keqing wouldn't exist at all. The idea behind this set is that the cooldown of your E ability is reduced by 1 second when you, as in Keqing, the active character, trigger an electro-related reaction. But since no reaction support can keep up with her speed in terms of elemental status application, she almost never gets to trigger those reactions herself, it's mostly her supports, and that way the 4-piece set effect doesn't work, it has to be her. If you now run Xingqiu, well it's not like he can keep up with her attack speed either, but that doesn't matter anymore because the Electro Charge reaction itself works a bit differently. As I mentioned before, both Hydro and Electro can remain on the target even after triggering the reaction. But wouldn't that theoretically mean that the target would have to be permanently electrocuted now for as long as both elements persist? Because that's what's supposed to happen when Hydro and Electro come together, right? And since that would likely not be very balanced, there's a 1 second cooldown between each Electrocharge proc, and only 1 instance of Electrocharge can be active on a target at any given time. So after you trigger EC for the very first time by either applying Hydro to Electro or Electro to Hydro, the next EC proc after that first one can only happen 1 second later. And the way I understood it is that whoever applies their respective element first after that 1 second window opens again, that unit gets the EC proc. And because Keqing applies Electro much more frequently than Xingqiu his Hydro, it's very likely that she gets the proc. So we can say that most of the time, not precisely all the time, but most of the time, she triggers the reaction. And that way she also gets the cooldown reduction and the bonus reaction damage from 4TF. In that sense, and in the context of Thundering Fury, Electrocharged is the only Electro-related reaction that rewards her for her fast attack speed and Electro application. Both Superconduct and Overload punish her for that, and it's always her supports that get to trigger the reaction. So, in short, Xingqiu turns 4TF into a viable option for Electro Keqing. On the one hand, it sucks that we have to rely on another unit that's even gated behind the gacha system to make use of this set, but on the other hand, I'm honestly just happy that we get to play with it at all. For me personally, 4TF Keqing is the most fun way to play her. I really like the idea of reducing her E cooldown instead of just giving it more damage, let's say. It fits her swift and agile playstyle, and I think it's just very rewarding to get her E back up in like 3 to 4 seconds. Now last but not least, to give you a slightly better idea of how the two actually play together, First, I'd like you to know that even though Xingqiu's ultimate requires you to be doing normal attacks, and Keqing can be a quite charge attack dependent unit, because she cannot perform charge attacks without weaving in at least one normal attack before every charge attack, I actually find that the duration of one charged attack cycle of hers matches perfectly with the internal cooldown of Xingqiu's sword waves. So even if you're spamming charged attacks, you're still getting the maximum amount of Hydro Swords from Xingqiu's ult. And then secondly and lastly, I'll just show you one of the combos that I like to do on beefier single targets. So what I like to do is lead off with Keqing's E, and as soon as you do that, the cooldown timer for this ability already starts ticking down in the background, even without reactivating it immediately. Then you have 5 seconds before her E disappears from the ground, which is more than enough time to swap to Xingqiu, do his E, then his Q, swap back immediately, and then before tapping Keqing's E again for the second time, what you can do is do one normal attack first, just to get that first Hydro Sword wave out as soon as possible, and then reactivate her E. After that, I just start doing normal attacks or spam charge attacks, and once my E is back up, I tap E again once, do one normal attack for the Hydro Swords, reactivate E for the slash, and go back to normal or charged attacking. I found that that way you get the most out of every Xingqiu ult. Of course, you don't have to be that OCD about it. This is just how I like to do it. Maybe it helped. If it did, you can try it out for yourself. Anyway, that's it for this video. Thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions, let me know down below, and I'll see you in the next one.